He was a billionaire who trusted no one. She was the doctor who broke his heart. When his baby stopped breathing in the ER, she was the only one who could save him. But this wasn't just any child. This was the son of her dead best friend, the friend who called 17 times before she died. The calls Grace never returned. Now she's back in Nate's life, caring for the baby through the night, and he's seeing something he never thought possible, a second chance. But his father has other plans, and some mistakes can't be forgiven. Before we begin, hit that like button and drop a comment telling us where you were watching from. Subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Now, let's dive in. The surgical lights blazed over Grace Winter's hands as she worked inside the chest cavity of a 6-year-old boy. 8 hours into the operation, her lower back screamed, her eyes burned, but her hands stayed steady. "Clamp," she said. The nurse placed it perfectly. This was the part Grace lived for. Not of the glory, not to the gratitude from parents afterward. This the moment between life and death where only skill mattered, where her demons went quiet. "Dr. Winters," the charge nurse's voice crackled through the intercom. "You have an emergency page. Trauma Bay 2. I'm in the middle of a procedure. Linda? It's marked urgent. Pediatric seizure. They're asking for you specifically." Grace's hands paused for half a second. In surgery, half a second was an eternity. "Tell them to page Ramirez. They asked for you by name." Something in Linda's tone made Grace look up at the observation window. Linda stood there, phone pressed to her ear, her face strained. "Dr. Vaughn, can you close?" Grace asked her mentor. Tessa Vaughn looked up from where she'd been assisting. "Go. I've got this." Grace stripped off her gloves and gown, scrubbed out in record time, and ran. Her sneakers squeaked on the linoleum as she burst through the trauma bay doors. Then she saw him. Nate Holloway stood at the center of controlled case, holding a baby who was convulsing. His $5,000 suit was wrinkled. His dark hair stuck up in all directions. His face was the color of ash. Their eyes met across the room. 4 years collapsed into 4 seconds. Every fight, every promise broken. Every night she'd spent convincing herself she was better off without him. "Help him with," Nate said. His voice cracked. "Please, Grace's training kicked in before her heart could fully process. She crossed to him, took the infant from his arms. The baby was burning up, his tiny body rigid with seizure activity. "How long has he been seizing?" 5 minutes, maybe 6. I don't know. I called 911 and just drove." Grace laid the baby on the gurney. "Get me 2 milligrams of lorazepam. Someone call anesthesia. I need an airway kit standing by." Her hands moved on autopilot. IV line placed. Medication pushed. The nurses worked around her like a choreographed dance she'd performed 1,000 times. The baby's seizures slowed, stopped. Grace finally allowed herself to breathe, to look at the child properly. Dark hair, gray eyes, a small birthmark on his left shoulder, shaped like a comma. Her blood turned to ice. "His name is Milo," Nate said quietly beside her. "He's 10 months old." Grace knew that birthmark. She'd seen it before, on her college roommate, on Vanessa Pierce, who'd married Nate Holloway 3 years ago, who'd died 6 months ago. Vanessa, who'd called Grace 17 times in her last month alive. 17 calls Grace had been too busy to return. "I need to intubate him," Grace heard herself say. "Everyone out except essential personnel." Nate grabbed her wrist. "I'm staying." Grace looked at where his hand touched her skin. Once upon a time, that touch had been everything. Now it felt like a brand. "Then stay out of my way." She intubated the baby with hands that refused to shake, even though her entire world was shaking, because this wasn't just any baby. This was Vanessa's son, the son of the woman who'd been Grace's best friend before Nate became Grace's entire universe. Before Grace had chosen her career over love and lost both, the baby stabilized. Grace stepped back, finally letting the nurses take over the monitoring. Nate stood against the wall, staring at his son like he might disappear if he blinked. "He needs a full workup," Grace said. Her voice sounded clinical, professional, nothing like the screaming inside her head. "CT scan, EEG, blood work. I'm admitting him to pediatric ICU. What's wrong with him?" "I don't know yet. Could be infection, could be metabolic. Could be neurological. She paused. Has he had seizures before? Nate's jaw tightened. No, he's been fussy lately. The nanny thought it was teething. The nanny. I have a company to run. Grace, I can't be home 24/7. There it was. The same excuse he'd given her 4 years ago when she'd begged him to show up to her brother's funeral. When she'd asked him to choose her. Just once. Over the company that consumed him. Some people never changed. I'll have the PICU nurse give you updates. Grace said. She turned to leave. Grace, wait. She stopped but didn't turn around. Thank you, Nate said. For saving him. Grace closed her eyes. It's my job. She walked out before he could see her face. Before he could see that she was barely holding herself together, because Vanessa's voice echoed in her memory. The voicemail Grace had finally listened to. 2 days after the funeral, she'd been too cowardly to attend. Grace, please call me back. I need to talk to someone who knew me before all this. Before Nate. Before everything got so complicated. I'm drowning here and I don't know how to swim anymore. Grace had been in surgery when that call came in. Had been saving someone else's life while her best friend had needed saving. Now she was standing in a hospital hallway, staring at her hands that saved strangers but had failed the people who actually mattered. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. Grace stood outside the PQ, watching through the window as Nate sat beside Milo's crib. 3 a.m. The hospital was quiet except for the beeping monitors and hushed conversations of night shift nurses. She'd tried to go home, had made it to the parking garage before turning around. The door opened. Tessa Vaughn appeared with 2 cups of coffee. You're hovering, Tessa said, handing her one. I'm monitoring my patient. Your patient who has 3 other capable doctors on his case. Tessa leaned against the wall beside her. Want to tell me why you're really still here? Grace took a sip of coffee. It was terrible. Hospital coffee always was. That's Vanessa Pierce's baby. Tessa's eyebrows rose. You're Vanessa. She wasn't my anything. We lost touch after college. And the father, Grace didn't answer. Didn't need to. Tessa had been her mentor through the worst of the breakup 4 years ago. Had held Grace together when she'd shown up to rounds with eyes swollen from crying. Oh, Grace, Tessa said softly. It's fine. I'm fine. You're standing outside PICU at 3 a.m, staring at your ex-boyfriend and your dead best friend's baby. That's the opposite of fine. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Inside, Nate had fallen asleep in the chair, his hand resting on Milo's crib, even in sleep. He looked exhausted, haunted. Vanessa called me, Grace whispered. Before she died, 17 times, I was too busy to call back, too wrapped up in my own cases, my own career, my own drama. She laughed bitterly. Everything I blamed Nate for doing to me, I did to her. Vanessa's death wasn't your fault, wasn't it? She had postpartum depression. She was isolated. She needed help. And I was too busy proving I didn't need anyone to notice she did. Tessa was quiet for a long moment. What are you going to do? My job, treat the baby. That's all I can do. But even as Grace said it, she knew it was a lie, because the moment Nate's eyes had met hers in that trauma bay, something had shifted. 4 years of carefully built walls had developed cracks, and Grace was terrified of what might come flooding through. Inside the PICU, Milo stirred, made a small sound. Nate woke instantly, leaning over the crib. Grace watched as he carefully adjusted the blanket, his hand gentle on his son's chest. This was a Nate she'd never seen. Vulnerable, scared, present. It made everything worse. I should go home, Grace said. You should, Tessa agreed. But you won't. Grace finished her coffee, set down the cup, pushed open the PIC door. Nate looked up as she entered. His eyes were bloodshot. He had stubble for the first time since Grace had known him. Nate Holloway, who'd never appeared in public looking less than perfect, looked like he'd aged 10 years in one night. How is he? Grace asked. The nurse said his vitals are stable. Temperature came down. Nate rubbed his face. They won't tell me anything else, just that we have to wait for test results. That's because we don't know anything else yet. Grace checked the monitors, even though she'd memorized Milo's numbers from the hallway. Seizures in infants can be caused by dozens of things, some serious, some not. We need to rule out the serious ones first. How long? 24 to 48 hours for most tests. Nate slumped back in the chair. I can't leave him. No one's asking you to. They stood in awkward silence. The machines beeped. Milo slept. You look good, Nate said finally. Grace almost laughed. I look like I've been to surgery for 8 hours. Don't lie to be polite now. Nate, it doesn't suit you. His jaw tightened. I'm trying to be civil. Why, we were never civil. We were either everything or nothing. There was no middle ground with us. Maybe that was the problem. Grace looked at him directly for the first time, really looked. The Nate she'd known had been all sharp edges and sharper ambition. This Nate had something different in his eyes, something broken. When did Vanessa die? Grace asked quietly. The change in his expression was immediate, shuddered. 6 months ago, postpartum complications. Complications is a nice word for it. What do you want me to say? Grace, that my wife killed herself, that she left me with a 4-month-old baby and a note that blamed me for not seeing how much she was suffering. His voice was low, vicious. That she mentioned you in that note, how you were the only person who might have understood, but you never called back. Grace felt the words hit like physical blows. She told you that. Not told, wrote. I found the note 3 days after the funeral when I finally got up the courage to go through her things. Nate leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You want to know what the worst part was? She was right. I didn't see it. I was too busy with board meetings and product launches and proving to myself that I hadn't made a mistake marrying someone I didn't love. The admission hung between them. Raw, ugly, true. Why did you marry her? Grace asked. Because she was safe. She did not make me feel like I was drowning. She didn't ask me to be someone I wasn't capable of being. He looked up. She wasn't you. Grace felt tears building but refused to let them fall. You can't put that on me. Nate, you made your choice. So did you. You walked away. Because you asked me to choose between you and my career. After watching you choose your career over me every single time, I was building something. So was I. Grace's voice rose slightly. I was becoming someone who could save lives, someone who mattered. And you acted like my work was a hobby compared to yours. A nurse glanced through the window. Grace lowered her voice. This isn't productive, she said. I'm your son's doctor. That's the only relationship we have now. Nate stood slowly, crossed the small space between them, stopped close enough that Grace could smell his cologne, the same one he'd always worn. Is that what you really want? He asked quietly. To pretend we're strangers. I want to do my job. I want to help Milo. Everything else is irrelevant. Liar. Grace stepped back. I'm going home. Dr. Chen will be here in the morning for rounds. Grace, wait. But she was already leaving. Already running, like she always did when things got too real, too painful, too close to the truth she'd spent 4 years trying to bury. She made it to her car before the tears came. Milo's test came back over the next 36 hours. Grace reviewed them with a growing sense of dread. The CT scan is clean, she told Nate in the family conference room. No tumors, no bleeding, no structural abnormalities. That's good, right? The EEG shows abnormal electrical activity consistent with seizure disorder. The blood work rules out infection and metabolic causes. Grace paused. But there's something else. She pulled up Milo's chart on the tablet, showed Nate the notes from the psychological assessment the PICU staff had done. Milo shows signs of reactive attachment disorder, Grace said carefully. It's a condition that develops when an infant doesn't form secure attachments with primary caregivers, usually due to neglect or inconsistent care. But in his case, she hesitated. The psychologist believes it's trauma-related, from losing his mother so suddenly. Nate stared at the screen. You're saying his seizures are psychological. I'm saying his body is manifesting his emotional trauma as physical symptoms. It's not uncommon in infants who experience significant loss. The stress hormones, the disrupted attachment, the confusion about why his mother disappeared. All of it can trigger neurological responses. So what do? Medication to control the seizures. But more importantly, attachment therapy, consistent caregiving, predictable routines. He needs to feel safe again. Nate rubbed his face. I have a nanny. She's been with him since Vanessa died. How many hours a day? I don't know. 12, 14. Grace kept her expression neutral. And you, oh, I see him in the mornings, sometimes evenings if I'm not in late meetings. Nate, that's not enough. He needs more than 12 minutes of parenting between board meetings. I'm doing the best I can, Nate snapped. Not all of us have the luxury of walking away from our responsibilities. The jab landed. Grace felt it sink in. You're right, she said quietly. I did walk away. From you. From Vanessa. From everyone who needed me because I was too scared of being needed. She met his eyes. Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't realize too late that the only thing that actually matters is showing up. Nate looked away. What if I don't know how? It was the most honest thing he'd said in 4 years. Grace took a breath, made a decision that would either save them all or destroy her completely. Let me help, she said. I'll take Milo's case personally. Do home visits, set up the therapy protocols, teach you what he needs. Why would you do that? Because I owe Vanessa. Because that baby deserves better than two people too broken to figure out how to love him properly. Because, Chef stopped. It doesn't matter why. Will you let me help? Nate studied her for a long moment. What's the catch? No catch. Just boundaries. This is about Milo, not about us, not about the pastue, just him. Can you actually do that? Be around me without it becoming about everything else? Grace wasn't sure, but she nodded anyway. I can try. Nate extended his hand. Then okay. Thank you. Grace shook it. His hand was warm, familiar. It took everything in her not to hold on longer than professionally appropriate. I'll arrange his discharge for tomorrow, she said. I'll come by the day after to set up the first therapy session. She left before he could respond, before she could second-guess the decision she'd just made. In the hallway, Tessa was waiting. I saw what you did in there, Tessa said. Don't. Grace, this is a terrible idea. Probably, but it's the right thing to do. The right thing would be transferring his care to another doctor. One without your history. I'm the best pediatric trauma specialist in this hospital. He needs the best. He needs a doctor who isn't in love with his father. Grace flinched. I'm not in love with Nate. That ended 4 years ago. Tessa gave her a look that said she wasn't buying it. Be careful. Some wounds reopen easier than others. Grace knew Tessa was right, but she'd already made her choice. She just hoped it wouldn't destroy her a second time. Nate's penthouse overlooked Central Park, floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, art that probably cost more than Grace made in a year. It looked exactly like Nate expensive, controlled, empty. A woman in her 50s answered the door. You must be Dr. Winters. I'm Patricia, the nanny. Patricia led Grace through rooms that felt more like a museum than a home. No toys scattered around. No baby gates. No evidence that a child lived here except for one closed door at the end of the hall. Mr. Holloway's on a call, Patricia said. He should be done soon. Can I get you something to drink? I'm fine, thank you. Patricia hesitated. Dr. Winters, can I ask you something? Off the record. Grace's instincts prickled. What is it? Is Milo going to be okay? Really okay? With proper treatment and consistent care. Yes. His prognosis is good. Patricia's shoulders relaxed slightly. Thank God that baby has been through enough. Losing his mother and now this. She lowered her voice. Between you and me, Mr. Holloway tries, but he doesn't know how to be a father. He barely looks at Milo sometimes, like he's afraid to get attached. How long have you worked for him? 6 months, since right after Miss Vanessa passed. It's heartbreaking. Really, she was such a sweet woman, so lost at the end. She used to talk about you. Actually, Grace's heart stopped. What did she say? That you were the smartest person she knew. That if she could just talk to you, you'd help her figure things out. She tried calling you a lot. Those last few weeks, Patricia's expression was kind but pitying. I think she needed a friend, someone outside of all this. She gestured at the expensive emptiness around them. Grace felt sick. I didn't know she needed help. I was just busy. We're all busy, dear. That's not your fault. But it was. Grace knew it was. A door opened. Nate emerged from his office, phone still pressed to his ear. He held up one finger to Grace. 1 minute. She watched him pace, listened to him negotiate something about quarterly earnings and market projections, watched the way his entire body language changed when he was in business mode. Confident, sharp, nothing like the broken man in the hospital. He ended the call, turned to Grace with a carefully neutral expression. Sorry about that. Crisis in Tokyo that couldn't wait. It's fine. Where's Milo? Sleeping. He's been fussy since we got home. Patricia said it's normal after a hospital stay. Can I see him? Nate led her to the nursery. It was beautifully decorated. Expensive crib, custom murals, every high-tech monitor and gadget available, and absolutely no warmth whatsoever. Milo slept in the center of the crib, tiny fists curled near his face. Grace's heart clenched. He looked so small, so vulnerable. She began her assessment, checked his reflexes, listened to his heart and lungs, made notes about his sleep position, breathing pattern, overall appearance. He looks healthy, Grace said. That's good. The medication is working. What happens now? Grace pulled out her tablet. I'm going to send you protocols for attachment therapy. Basically, it's about building predictable routines, responding consistently to his needs, making him feel safe. That's it. Just be consistent. It sounds simple. It's not. It means being present, not just physically, but emotionally. It means putting his needs above everything else, including your business. Nate's jaw tightened. I have a company to run. Grace, 12,000 employees depending on me, and one baby depending on you more. You need to decide which matters more. That's not fair. No, it's not. But it's reality. Milo can't wait for you to find work-life balance. He needs you now, consistently, or his condition will get worse. They stared at each other, old patterns resurfacing, the same argument they'd had 100 times 4 years ago, just with different specifics. I'll try, Nate said finally. Trying isn't enough. You either do it or you don't. Then tell me how, because I don't know how to be what he needs. I don't know how to be what anyone needs. His voice cracked slightly. Vanessa figured that out too late. Grace felt her anger deflate. This was the Nate she'd loved, the one who showed his cracks only when pushed past his limit. You start by showing up, she said more gently. You hold him. You talk to him. You let yourself be imperfect and present instead of perfect and absent. That's all attachment is, being there consistently, even when it's hard. Will you help me? Really help, not just supervise. Grace knew she should say no, knew this was crossing lines she'd sworn never to cross again. 3 weeks, she heard herself say. I'll come every day for 3 weeks. We'll do the therapy together, teach you the protocols. After that, you're on your own. 3 weeks. Okay. Nate extended his hand again. Thank you. Grace didn't shake it this time. Don't thank me yet. This is going to be uncomfortable for both of us. But if we're doing this, we need ground rules. Like what? No talking about the past, no rehashing old fights, no trying to be friends. This is professional, clinical, only about Milo. Agreed. And if at any point this becomes too complicated, I'm out. I'll transfer his care and walk away. Understood. Understood. They were still standing over Milo's crib. Still close enough that Grace could feel the heat radiating from Nate's body. Still caught in that terrible space between past and present. Milo stirred, made a small sound. Nate immediately tensed. Is he okay? He's fine, just dreaming. See how his eyes are moving under his eyelids. They watched Milo sleep. In that moment, with a baby between them and 4 years of pain behind them, Grace felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not even understanding. Just a small crack in the wall she'd built. It terrified her. Day 1 of attachment therapy disaster. Milo screamed for 45 minutes straight. Nothing worked. Not bottles, not rocking, not singing. He just cried with the kind of desperation that broke hearts. Nate paced with him, looking more panicked by the minute. What am I doing wrong? Nothing. He's grieving. This is normal. This doesn't feel normal. Grief never does. Grace guided Nate through the protocols, skin-to-skin contact, consistent responses, predictable patterns. But Milo fought every attempt at comfort. He hates me, Nate said finally, setting Milo in the crib. He knows I'm not her. He doesn't hate you. He's confused. His world stopped making sense when Vanessa died. He needs time to learn that you're safe, that you won't disappear too. What if I'm not safe? What if I'm just going to mess him up worse? Grace recognized the spiral, the same one she'd been in for 6 months after her brother died, when every patient felt like a test she might fail. Then you mess him up while trying. That's all any parent can do. Day 3, small progress. Milo let Nate hold him for 20 minutes without crying. It felt like winning a war. Day 5, Nate's father showed up unannounced. Richard Holloway walked into the penthouse like he owned it. Probably because he did, or at least owned enough of Nate's company to act like he did. "Who's this?" Richard asked, looking at Grace like she was furniture. "Dr. Winters, Milo's physician. And she's here. Why, attachment therapy. Milo has reactive attachment disorder from losing his mother." Richard scoffed. "In my day, we called that being spoiled. Kid needs discipline, not therapy." Grace felt her professional mask crack. "In your day, infant mortality was triple what it is now. Things change. Science advances. We know better." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You've got some nerve, talking to me like that in my son's home." "Actually, this is my home," Nate said quietly. "And Dr. Winters is right. Times change." Something passed between father and son. Something old and bitter. Richard turned to Grace. "I know who you are. Nathan's ex-girlfriend, the one who walked away when he needed her most. Now you're back. Convenient timing. I'm here for Milo. Nothing else." "Sure you are." Richard walked to the bar, poured himself whiskey even though it was 11 a.m. "Nathan, I need to talk to you about the company. Privately. I'm busy." "This can't wait." Grace saw Nate waver, saw the old patterns trying to reassert, the need to please his father, to prove himself, to sacrifice everything for approval he'd never actually receive. "Actually, Mr. Holloway, we're in the middle of a critical session," Grace said. "Whatever you need can wait an hour." Richard's face darkened. "I don't take orders from the help." "Then take it from me," Nate said, surprising everyone, including himself. "Come back later. We're busy." After Richard left, Nate sank into a chair. "That's going to cost me." "How mayagum? My father controls the family trust, which controls 40% of voting shares in my company. If he decides I'm not managing the company properly, he can call an emergency board vote. Remove me as CEO." Would he actually do that? If he thought I was choosing personal life over the company? Absolutely. He's been waiting for an excuse since I married Vanessa. Said I was getting soft, losing focus. "Nate, you can't keep living under his thumb." Easy for you to say. You don't have 12,000 paws hanging over your head. The old argument again. Always the same script with different words. But this time, something was different. This time, Milo was in the next room, depending on them both to figure it out. "Fine," Grace said. "Then we do this faster, more intensive. Instead of 1-hour sessions, I'll be here all day, morning through evening. We accelerate the therapy. I can't pay you for that much time. I'm not doing it for money. I'm doing it because that baby deserves better than watching his father choose business over him the way you chose business over everything." The words came out harsher than Grace intended. She saw Nate flinch. "I'm sorry," she started. "No, you're right." Nate stood, walked to the window. "I keep making the same mistakes, thinking if I just work hard enough, earn enough, prove enough, then I'll be worthy of actually having a life. But it never works." Vanessa figured that out. You figured that out. Even Milo seems to know. Then change. "How this is who I am, Grace. This is all I know how to be." Grace joined him at the window. The city sprawled below them. Millions of people living millions of lives. Most of them just trying to figure out how to be enough for the people they loved. "You be enough by being present," Grace said. That's the secret everyone eventually learns. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be there. Nate looked at her, really looked. Is that what you're doing? Being present, or are you just trying to assuage your guilt about Vanessa? The question hit too close to home. Both, Grace admitted. I'm absolutely trying to make up for failing her. But I'm also here because that baby deserves someone who actually gives a damn. And right now, I'm the only option. That's not true. You're not the only option. I'm here too. Are you, or are you just waiting for the next crisis that gives you an excuse to leave? Nate turned away. I don't know. I honestly don't know anymore. It was the most honest answer he'd given. Grace decided to take it as progress. 2 weeks into intensive therapy, Milo smiled at Nate for the first time. It was a small thing, just a little upturn of his mouth when Nate sang an off-key lullaby. But Nate's face transformed, like he'd just witnessed a miracle. Grace felt her heart crack open, despite all her careful walls. Did you see that? Nate whispered. He smiled. At me. He's starting to trust you. That's huge. They were sitting on the floor of the nursery, Milo between them, playing with soft blocks. This had become their routine. Morning therapy sessions, afternoon playtime, evening winding down, Grace present for all of it, teaching Nate what consistent care actually looked like. It was intimate in ways that terrified her. I have a confession, Nate said. I've been turning down meetings, delegating more. Owen is handling most of the day-to-day operations now. That's good. That's exactly what you should be doing. My father is furious. He showed up yesterday when you were gone, said I'm throwing away everything he built, everything he taught me. Your father didn't build this company. You did. With his money, his connections, his strategy. He's not wrong. Grace, without him, I'd still be writing code in a basement somewhere. Would that be so terrible? Nate looked at her sharply. What? Would it be so terrible to just be someone writing code, someone with a normal life and normal hours and the ability to be present for his kid? That's easy for you to say. You didn't grow up like I did. You didn't have to fight for everything. Prove you deserve to exist. Grace felt the old defensiveness rising, but she pushed it down. This wasn't about their past. This was about Milo's future. You're right, she said. I had a different childhood, but I did have to prove myself. Every woman in surgery does. Every shift, every case, every time we speak up in rounds, we're proving we deserve to be there to make him. So don't act like you are the only one who knows what it means to fight. Milo grabbed at Grace's finger, held on with his tiny grip. He does that a lot, Nate observed. Holds on to you. He's building attachment. It's healthy. With you, he's building attachment with you, not me. Grace heard the hurt in his voice. He's building it with both of us. That's the point. Multiple secured attachments. Not just one person. But what happens when you leave? When the 3 weeks are up and you walk away like we agreed? Grace had been trying not to think about that. About the inevitable moment when she'd have to step back, let go, return to her life that suddenly felt empty compared to these hours in Nate's apartment, building something fragile and impossible. Then you'll keep doing what we've been practicing, she said. The routines we've established, the responses we've been working on. You'll be fine. Well, I bet. You have to be. He needs you to be. They sat in silence. Milo babbled between them, oblivious to the weight of the conversation. Grace's phone rang. Tessa. Excuse me, Grace said, stepping into the hallway. Where are you, Bez? Tessa asked without preamble. Home visit. Milo's doing really well with the therapy. Grace, I need you to come to the hospital. Now. Something in Tessa's voice made Grace's stomach drop. What's wrong? Richard Holloway filed a complaint with the medical board. Against you. He's claiming inappropriate relationship with a patient's family. Conflict of interest. Violation of professional boundaries. Grace felt the floor tilt. He can't do that. I've followed every protocol. Everything has been documented. He also submitted evidence of your psychiatric hospitalization from when you were 19, after your brother died. That's sealed medical records. How did he even get that? Money buys a lot of things. Grace, including sealed records. The board is meeting tomorrow. They want you to come in, explain your relationship with the Holloway family, justify your treatment decisions. Grace sank against the wall. This is going to destroy my career. Not if we fight it. But Grace, you need to understand what he's really doing. This isn't about protecting Milo. This is about controlling Nate, getting you out of the picture so Nate falls back in line, chooses the company over everything else. I can't believe he'd go this far. You don't know Richard Holloway. I've seen him destroy people for less. He views anything that threatens his control as an existential threat. Grace closed her eyes, thought about Milo's smile, about Nate's slowly growing confidence as a father, about the fragile progress they'd made, all of it about to be demolished because of Richard's need for control. What do I do? You walk away, right now, end treatment, transfer Milo's care, distance yourself completely. It's the only way to protect your license. And Milo, what happens to him? Milo has other doctors. He'll be fine. But Grace knew that wasn't true. Milo was just starting to heal, just starting to trust. Pulling away now would reinforce every abandonment fear he had. I can't do that to him, Grace said. Then you might lose everything. Grace, I know you care about this baby, but you have to think about your career, your future. You can't save everyone. Grace thought about her brother, about Vanessa, about all the people she'd failed to save because she'd been too focused on the wrong things. I have to go, she said. I'll call you tomorrow. She hung up, stood in the hallway for a long moment, trying to steady herself. When she returned to the nursery, Nate took one look at her face and said, "What happened?" Grace told him, everything. The complaint, the records, the meeting tomorrow. Nate's expression went from confused to enraged. That son of a, he had no right. Those records are private, sealed. Apparently not sealed enough. I'll talk to him. Tell him to drop this. That won't work. He wants me gone. And honestly, maybe he's right. Maybe I have been crossing lines, getting too involved, letting this become personal when it should have stayed professional. Grace, don't do this. Don't let him win. This isn't about winning. It's about what's best for Milo. And maybe what's best is for me to step back. Let another doctor take over. Someone without our history. Someone who can be objective? No, absolutely not. Milo needs you. Milo needs stability. And I'm about to become a liability. For him and for you. Nate stood, paced. There has to be another way. If there is, I don't see it. They stood in the nursery, 3 feet and 4 years, and a dying career between them. Milo played with his blocks, unaware that his world was about to shift again. Grace felt her heart breaking, not for herself, for him, for the baby who'd already lost so much and was about to lose more because adults couldn't figure out how to put him first. I'm sorry, Ipsan, she said quietly. I should never have agreed to this. I should have known better. She left before Nate could respond, before she could see the look on his face, before she could change her mind and stay in a situation that was destroying them all. Outside, Grace sat in her car and finally let herself cry. For Milo, for Vanessa, for the girl she'd been at 19 who tried to die because grief felt too heavy to carry, for all the ways love kept failing everyone who needed it most. The medical board hearing room was exactly as cold and sterile as Grace expected. 5 board members sat behind a long table. Richard Holloway sat in the back, looking satisfied. Tessa sat beside Grace, acting as her advocate. Dr. Winters, the board chair began, you've been accused of multiple ethical violations in your treatment of the patient known as Millionaire. Can you explain your relationship with the child's father? Nathan Holloway. Grace kept her voice steady. Nathan Holloway and I had a relationship 4 years ago. It ended. We had no contact until his son was admitted to my ER 2 weeks ago with seizures. And yet you chose to take the case personally. I'm the hospital's lead pediatric trauma specialist. The case required my expertise. But then you went beyond standard treatment, home visits, extended therapy sessions, living in the family home. I wasn't living there, I was conducting intensive attachment therapy, which requires extended observation and intervention, All of this was documented and approved by my supervising physician. One of the board members, a stern woman named Dr. Harrison, leaned forward. Dr. Winters, we have records showing you were hospitalized at 19 for suicidal ideation. Can you speak to how that might impact your judgment in high-stress medical situations? Grace felt Tessa tense beside her. This was the kill shot, the thing that could end her career with one wrong answer. At 19, I experienced a mental health crisis after my brother died due to medical negligence. Grace said carefully. I received treatment. I've been in ongoing therapy since. My mental health history has never impacted my ability to provide excellent care to my patients. In fact, it makes me more empathetic to families experiencing trauma. Or it makes you overly emotionally involved. Richard interjected from the back, which is exactly what happened here. My grandson needed objective medical care. Instead, he got a doctor trying to work out her own psychological issues through him. Mr. Holloway, you'll have your chance to speak, the chair said, but Richard wasn't done. That woman has been manipulating my son, using his grief over his wife, using his guilt about their past relationship. She's convinced him to neglect his business, his responsibilities, everything I taught him, all so she can play house with someone else's baby. That's not true, Grace said. Isn't it? Tell this board why Vanessa Holloway called you 17 times in the month before she killed herself. Tell them how you ignored your best friend's cries for help because you were too busy with your precious career. The room went silent. Grace felt her throat close, felt every eye on her. Vanessa Pierce was my college roommate, Grace said quietly. We lost touch after graduation. I didn't know she was struggling. I didn't know she needed help. When I found out she'd died, I listened to her voicemails. She had called me multiple times. I'd been in surgery. I'd been busy. I'd been focused on other patients. Her voice cracked. I failed her, completely. And I've been trying to make up for that failure by helping her son. So you admit this is personal, Dr. Harrison said. All medicine is personal. Every patient is someone's child, someone's parent, someone who matters to someone else. Yes, Milo matters to me personally, because his mother mattered to me, because I failed her, so because I can't fail him too. That's exactly the problem, another board member said. You're not providing objective care. You're trying to absolve yourself of guilt. That's not medicine. That's therapy for yourself at the patient's expense. Grace felt the walls closing in, felt her career, her identity, everything she'd built crumbling. If I may, ma'am, Tessa said, standing, I'd like to provide some context the board might not have. I was the attending physician when Dr. Winter's brother died. I made the mistake that killed him. I then covered it up. For 15 years. I let Grace believe it was her family doctor's error. I let her carry guilt. That was mine. The room erupted. Board members talking over each other. Richard looking confused. Grace staring at Tessa in shock. What are you doing? Grace whispered. What I should have done 15 years ago. Tessa said, telling the truth. Tessa turned back to the board. Grace Winters is the most ethical doctor I've ever trained. Her ability to care deeply about her patients doesn't make her less professional. It makes her exceptional. And if you censure her for that, for having empathy and commitment and the courage to take on difficult cases with complicated histories, then you are punishing exactly the qualities we claim to want in physicians. The chair held up his hand for silence. Dr. Vaughn, are you confessing to medical malpractice and falsification of records? Yes, and I'm prepared to face the consequences. But not before I make sure you understand that Grace Winters saved that baby's life. Multiple times. Not just medically, but emotionally. She gave him a chance to heal from trauma that was literally manifesting as seizures. She did what any good doctor would do. She showed up. The board members conferred in whispers. Finally, the chair spoke. This hearing is adjourned while we investigate Dr. Vaughn's admission. Dr. Winters, you're suspended pending our investigation. You're not to have any contact with the patient or the patient's family until this matter is resolved. That Grace felt the room spin. How long? Could be weeks. Could be months. Depends on what we find. Richard stood, looking triumphant. Thank you for your time. I'm sure you'll make the right decision. Outside, Grace grabbed Tessa's arm. Why did you do that? You just destroyed your career. My career was built on a lie. Yours isn't. And that baby needs you more than I need a clean record. Tessa smiled sadly. Consider it my amends. 15 years too late, but better than never. Tessa, go home. Grace, rest. This will work out. But Grace knew it wouldn't. She'd been suspended, forbidden from seeing Milo, from finishing what she'd started. Richard had won. She sat in her car, staring at her phone, wanting to call Nate, wanting to explain. But the board had been clear. No contact. So she drove home alone, to an empty apartment that suddenly felt like a prison, and tried to figure out how everything had fallen apart so completely. Grace lasted 3 days before the walls started closing in. Day 1. She cleaned her apartment, top to bottom, every surface, every corner, trying to scrub away the feeling of failure that clung to her skin. Day 2, she went through Vanessa's voicemails again, all 17 of them. Listened to her friend's voice getting progressively more desperate, more alone, more convinced that no one cared. Grace, it's me again. I know you're busy. I don't know who else to call. Nate is always working. His father barely acknowledges I exist. The baby cries all the time, and I don't know if it's him or me or if I'm just broken. Call me back. Please. Day 3, Grace didn't get out of bed, didn't shower, didn't eat, just stared at the ceiling and wondered how many people she'd failed trying to save everyone except the ones who actually mattered. Her phone rang. Not Nate. She checked. Some number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Grace Winters. A woman's voice. Professional. Cold. Yes. This is Jennifer Keller from Holloway & Associates. I'm Richard, Holloway's attorney. I'm calling to inform you that Mr. Holloway is filing for emergency custody of his grandson. He's citing your inappropriate involvement as evidence of Nathan Holloway's impaired judgment and inability to provide a stable environment for the child. Grace sat up. What? He can't do that. Nate is Milo's father. Mr. Holloway has grandparent rights and significant evidence that Nathan is neglecting his business responsibilities, making poor decisions, and exposing the child to unstable influences. Namely you. This is insane. Nate is finally learning to be present for his son. That's not neglect. That's good parenting. That will be for the court to decide. The hearing is scheduled for next week. You are not to have any contact with Nathan or the child. Any attempt to do so will be used as evidence of your continued boundary violations. Do you understand? I understand that Richard Holloway is trying to control his son's life by weaponizing that baby. Have a good day. Dr. Winters? The line went dead. Grace stared at her phone, felt the rage building. Not the hot, explosive kind. The cold, calculated kind that made decisions. She got out of bed, showered, dressed, made a plan. If Richard wanted to play dirty, she could too. Grace drove to Vanessa's parents' house in Connecticut. She'd never met them. Vanessa had been estranged from her family since college, but Grace had an address from the funeral she'd been too cowardly to attend. Mrs. Pierce answered the door, older, worn down, with eyes that had seen too much grief. Can I help you? My name is Grace Winters. I was Vanessa's friend. I need to talk to you about your grandson. Mrs. Pierce's expression shifted. You're the doctor from the hospital. The one Vanessa kept calling. Yes. I'm so sorry. I should have called her back. I should have. Come in. The house was modest. Photos of Vanessa everywhere. Baby pictures, school photos, her wedding day, a shrine to a daughter lost too soon. Richard Holloway came here, Mrs. Pierce said, pouring tea with shaking hands. After Vanessa died, he brought papers for us to sign, giving up any claim to our grandson, said we'd abandoned Vanessa, so we had no right to her child. Did you sign? Well, yeah, my husband did. He was so guilty about how things ended with Vanessa. He thought maybe Richard was right, that we didn't deserve to know our grandson. She set down the teapot. But I kept something Richard wanted destroyed. She left the room, returned with a journal, leather-bound, well-worn. Vanessa gave this to me 3 weeks before she died. She said if anything happened to her, I should read it, then decide what to do with it. Grace took the journal with trembling hands. What's in it? The truth. About Richard. About the marriage. About everything Vanessa went through. Mrs. Pierce's eyes filled with tears. She tried to leave, you know, tried to take Milo and get away. Richard threatened her. Said he'd make sure she never saw her son again. Said he had lawyers who could prove she was unfit, unstable, dangerous. He drove her to suicide. He trapped her, controlled her, made her feel like the only escape was death. Mrs. Pierce pushed the journal toward Grace. That's why I'm giving this to you. Because Richard is doing the same thing to Nathan now. And that baby deserves better than to be raised by a man who treats people like possessions. Grace opened the journal, read Vanessa's handwriting. Neat at first, then progressively more frantic. Richard controls everything. What I wear, who I see. He even paid my therapist to report everything I said back to him. I'm not paranoid. I found the checks. He's literally buying information about my mental health so he can use it against me if I ever try to leave. I called Grace again. She didn't answer. I don't blame her. Why would she want anything to do with this mess I made my bed marrying into this family? Now I have to lie in it. I love Milo so much it hurts, but I don't know how to protect him from becoming like his father, like his grandfather. I don't know how to teach him love when I'm surrounded by people who only understand control. The last entry was dated 2 days before Vanessa died. If you're reading this, I'm gone. Please know I loved my son. Please know I tried. Please don't let Richard win. Don't let him turn Milo into another hollow man who mistakes power for love. Someone has to break this cycle. I'm just too tired to be that someone. Grace closed the journal, felt tears streaming down her face. What will you do with it? Mrs. Pierce asked. Whatever it takes to save that baby from becoming his grandfather. Grace drove back to the city with the journal on her passenger seat. Evidence of Richard's abuse, proof of his manipulation, the weapon she needed to destroy him. But using it meant exposing Vanessa's pain publicly, meant dragging her memory through court proceedings and media coverage, meant potentially destroying the family Milo had left. Grace sat in her car outside her apartment building, staring at the journal, trying to decide what mattered more, protecting the dead or saving the living. Her phone rang. Nate. She shouldn't answer. The board had been clear. Richard's lawyer had threatened her. She answered anyway. Grace Pete. His voice was wrecked. He took him. My father took Milo. The court gave him emergency temporary custody pending a full hearing. They said I'm an unfit parent because I prioritized you over my business, because I let personal relationships cloud my judgment, because I'm exactly what my father always said I was weak. Nate, where are you? I and him. Our cabin, the one upstate where we used to go. I just drove. I couldn't be in that apartment anymore. Every room reminds me of them. Vanessa, Milo, you. Everyone I've failed. Grace heard the desperation in his voice, the edge that scared her. Stay there, I'm coming to you. Grace, you can't. You'll lose your license. I don't care, I'm coming. Don't do anything stupid. Just wait for me. She hung up, grabbed the journal, started driving. The board could suspend her. Richard could sue her. None of it mattered compared to the sound of Nate's voice on that phone. The sound of a man at the edge of breaking completely. Grace found Nate on the dock at 2 a.m. The cabin was exactly as she remembered. Small, isolated, perfect for people trying to escape the world. Nate sat with his legs dangling over the water, staring at the stars reflected on the lake's surface. You came, he said without turning around. Of course I came. Grace sat beside him. Their shoulders touched. After 3 weeks of careful distance, the contact felt electric. I keep thinking about what Vanessa's note said. Nate continued, that I was so focused on proving myself to my father that I couldn't see she was drowning. And now I'm doing it again with Milo, letting my father's approval matter more than actually being a father. That's not true. You were learning. You were changing. Was I? Or was I just performing change because you were watching the second you were gone? The first thing I did was listen to my father. Let him convince me you were the problem. Let him take my son because I was too weak to fight him. Grace pulled out Vanessa's journal. Read this. Nate took it with shaking hands, read by the light of his phone. Grace watched his expression shift from confusion to horror to rage. He paid her therapist to spy on her. Nate whispered. He trapped her. He killed her. Not directly, but yes. He created conditions that made death feel like the only escape. I have to destroy him. I have to make him pay for what he did. We will, but not with revenge. With truth. We expose what he did. We get Milo back. We break the cycle. Nate looked at her. Why are you helping me after everything? After I chose him over you again? Why are you still here? Because someone has to break the pattern. Because that baby deserves better. Because, Grace took a breath. Because I love you. I've always loved you. Even when I hated you. Even when I left. Even when I convinced myself I was better off alone. I never stopped loving you. The admission hung between them. 4 years of denial collapsing in one sentence. I love you too, Nate said. That's the problem. I loved you so much it terrified me. So I chose things that felt safer. The company, my father's approval, Vanessa, who didn't ask me to be vulnerable. I chose everything except the one thing that actually mattered. So choose different now. Choose Milo. Choose yourself. Choose us. What if I fail again? Then you fail, but you do it while trying. That's all any of us can do. They sat in silence. The lake lapped at the peak. The stars wheeled overhead. Two broken people trying to figure out how to become whole enough to save a baby. The custody hearing is in 4 days, Nate said finally. My father has lawyers. Power. He'll destroy us. Then we fight dirty. We use Vanessa's journal. We expose him publicly. We make it impossible for the court to ignore what he did. That will destroy my company. He'll tank the stock. Call emergency board meetings. It'll be a massacre. Do you care, Nate thought about it. Really thought. No, I don't. Let it burn. Let all of it burn if that's what it takes to get my son back. Grace felt something shift between them. Not just decision, but commitment. The kind that couldn't be undone. Okay then, she said. We go to war. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Grace reached out to Mrs. Pierce, got her to agree to testify. Nate called every board member personally, explained what was happening, offered to step down as CEO to protect the company from the fallout. Most of them were surprisingly supportive. Turned out Richard had made enemies over the decades. People were just waiting for someone brave enough to stand up to him. On the morning of the hearing, Grace woke up in the cabin to find Nate already awake, sitting on the porch with coffee. Ready? She asked. No, but we're doing it anyway. The courtroom was packed, Richard and his lawyers on one side, Nate, Grace, and a surprisingly fierce family law attorney named Rebecca Collins on the other. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Martinez. She looked tired of everyone's nonsense before they even started. Let's be clear, Judge Martinez said. This is about the welfare of one child, not business disputes, not family grudges, one baby who deserves stability. Understood. Everyone nodded. Richard's lawyer went first, painted Nate as negligent, distracted, unable to prioritize his responsibilities, painted Grace as unstable, manipulative, using the baby to get back with her ex. Then Rebecca stood up. Your Honor, we'd like to submit evidence that Richard Holloway engaged in systematic abuse and control of his late daughter-in-law, Vanessa Holloway. This journal, written by Vanessa herself, details years of psychological manipulation, financial control, and isolation. It also includes evidence that Mr. Holloway paid Vanessa's therapist to violate doctor-patient confidentiality. The courtroom exploded. Richard's face turned purple. That's slander. That journal could be fake. Could be. We have Vanessa's therapist willing to testify. Rebecca continued calmly. Dr. Simon Parker has agreed to admit to accepting payments from Richard Holloway in exchange for information about his patient. He's already surrendered his license. He's prepared to testify fully. Judge Martinez held up her hand. I'll need to review this evidence. We're taking a recess. 2 hours later, they reconvened. Judge Martinez looked at Richard with open disgust. Mr. Holloway, I've read the journal. I've reviewed the evidence. If even half of what's in here is true, you're lucky you're not facing criminal charges. As it stands, Your petition for custody is denied. Full custody remains with Nathan Holloway. You are ordered to have no unsupervised contact with the child until he is 18. You can't do this, Richard sputtered. I'm his grandfather. I have rights. Rights end when they're used to abuse and control. You're done here. Richard stood, looked at Nate with pure venom. You've destroyed everything I built, everything I gave you. You'll regret this. No, Nate said quietly. I'll regret the 38 years I spent trying to earn love from someone who didn't know how to give it. This is the first thing I've done that I won't regret. Richard stormed out. His lawyers scrambled after him. Judge Martinez turned to Nate. Mr. Holloway, I'm returning your son to your custody, but I'm ordering family therapy, regular check-ins with child services. I want to make sure this baby has the stability he needs. Understood. Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Outside the courthouse, Nate pulled Grace into his arms, held her like she might disappear. We did it, he said. We actually did it. Now comes the hard part. Actually raising him. Nate laughed. It sounded rusty but real. Will you help me? Really help, not as his doctor, as, I don't know what, but will you stay? Grace thought about all the reasons she should say no, the complications, the history, the risk of getting hurt again. Then she thought about Milo's smile, about Vanessa's last wish, about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, some second chances were worth taking. Yeah, she said. I'll stay. Grace woke up to the sound of babbling. She rolled over in bed, reaching for Nate, but his side was empty. She found them in the kitchen. Nate making pancakes with Milo strapped to his chest in a carrier. The baby grabbed at everything, making Nate's cooking more difficult, but infinitely more joyful. Morning, Nate said when he saw her. We're making breakfast. Well, I'm making breakfast. Milo is providing commentary. Grace poured coffee, watched them work. 16-month-old Milo was thriving, walking, talking in his own way, laughing constantly. The seizures had stopped completely. Sleep okay? Nate asked. Better. The nightmares are less frequent. They'd both been in therapy, individual and couples, working through decades of damage, learning how to be whole people instead of broken ones, pretending. It was hard. Some days were harder than others, but they were doing it. Grace's medical license had been reinstated after Tessa's confession and subsequent resignation. The board had investigated, found no actual ethical violations in Grace's treatment of Milo, and given her a formal apology. Tessa had lost her license but seemed strangely at peace. I carried that lie for 15 years, she'd told Grace. Now I can finally breathe. Nate had stepped down as CEO, worked part-time as a consultant, spent most of his time being a father, being present, learning that success wasn't measured in quarterly earnings but in moments like this, messy, imperfect, beautiful. Patricia called, Grace said. She wants to know if she can take Milo to the park this afternoon. Patricia, Vanessa's mother-in-law, had become a regular presence in their lives, a grandmother who actually wanted to be involved, who brought healing instead of harm. That works. I have therapy at 2 anyway. They'd established routines. Therapy, date nights, family dinners, regular check-ins with child services that had gone from supervision to simple support, building a life that wasn't perfect, but was real. The doorbell rang. Grace answered it. Rebecca Collins stood there with a folder. Is this a social visit or professional? Grace asked. Bit of both. Can I come in? They sat at the table. Milo reached for Rebecca, who'd become another aunt figure in his expanding circle of people who loved him. Richard Holloway died yesterday, Rebecca said without preamble. Heart attack. His lawyers contacted me this morning. Nate went still. Oh, boy. He left you everything. The company shares, the trust fund, the estate, all of it, with one condition. What condition? Rebecca smiled slightly. That you never let Milo become like him. Direct quote from the will, I broke my son. Don't let him break his own. Nate stared at the papers. He knew. At the end, he knew what he'd done. Doesn't make it better, Grace said quietly. No, but maybe it's something. An acknowledgement. An apology he couldn't say out loud. They sat in silence, processing, grieving someone who'd caused so much pain, but was still family. Are you okay? Grace asked. I don't know. Ask me in a year. Fair enough. After Rebecca left, they took Milo to the park, watched him play into the sandbox, held hands while their son laughed and lived, and had no idea how close he'd come to being broken like the generations before him. Do you think we're messing him up? Nate asked. Despite everything? Probably, everyone does. The goal isn't perfection. It's trying. Think we'll ever get married? The question surprised Grace. They'd been living together for 4 months, co-parenting, building a life. But they'd never discussed marriage. Do you want to? She asked. Eventually, when we're ready, when it's not about fixing things but celebrating them. That's a good answer. They sat on a bench, watching Milo, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, the city distant but present, lives being lived all around them. I talked to Vanessa, Grace said suddenly. Nate looked at her. What? At the cemetery. Last week, I finally went. I told her about Milo, about us, about how we're trying to do better with her son than we did with each other the first time. Grace wiped her eyes. I like to think she'd be happy, that she'd see we're finally figuring it out. I think she would be. I think she'd also be yelling at both of us for taking so long. They laughed. It felt good to laugh about it, to honor Vanessa's memory without drowning in guilt. Milo ran over, arms outstretched. They both reached for him at the same time, caught him together. Love you, Billis, Milo said, his first clear words. Grace felt her heart split open. We love you too, sweet boy. Nate pulled them both close. His family, broken, rebuilt, still figuring it out. Think we can do this? He asked. Actually pull off the whole happy family thing. I think we can try. That's all anyone can really promise. To keep trying. Then that's what we'll do. They sat there, the three of them, as the sun set over the park, starting to understand that healing wasn't about being fixed. It was about being willing to keep showing up, day after day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, because love wasn't about perfection. It was about presence, about choosing each other, again and again, even when easier options existed. It was about breaking cycles, building better, trying to leave the next generation less damaged than the last. It was enough. They were enough. Together, they were enough. And for the first time in either of their lives, that felt like everything.